Welcome to our visitors from wherever you have joined us here upon our humble and small alpine town. We welcome you on a lovely day here at winter. The winters usually are much worse than this, and you've got the good luck of joining on a day that's not gale force, hurricane-like winds. We welcome you, and we are going through a series, have been for many years now, on the book of Deuteronomy. This is not a random sermon here. We've been progressing through this great work of the Old Testament for I've lost track, I think 2 years at least. We're in the third year, I believe, if I recall correctly. Interspaced, of course, throughout the various Christian feast days and other such holy days of the Christian calendar. We've arrived now and alighted upon chapter 20. For those who are regular, of course, you know we've been working through this middle portion of the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, which is the Deuteronomic Code. All the various sections we've been covering, of course, in recent chapters, much concerning the ecclesiastical and the civic structure of the ancient Israelite kingdom. The commands given for officers and judges, we've seen those mentioned there in verse 9 in our passage today. Of course, the law of the king, we spent many weeks there, I think 4 or 5 weeks in the end of chapter 17. We then progressed through chapters 18 and 19 concerning the priesthood and concerning the officials of the church, so on and so forth. And then now coming in here, we have a transition wherein upon we have a repetition, as is of course often the case in this book, where Moses, the great prophet, is reminding the people effectively, but he's repeating things that have already been laid out and spelt out in greater detail in either the book of Exodus or in the book of Numbers, or sometimes even in the book of Leviticus. Okay, this such example is just that. These are commands that have already been touched upon. The reading that we had earlier from the opening chapter of the book of Joshua, today's Old Testament reading, Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 9, is thereupon the exact same thing. Joshua, the successor of Moses as the leader and commander of God's people, then repeats actually by word effectively the very same command to be not afraid. And that's where, of course, we find a very famous portion of the Old Testament, in fact, probably one of the most well-known lines or sentences of the Old Testament: be strong and courageous. It is one of the most common things that God commands of us as his people, is be not afraid, right, or do not fear. Be strong and courageous. Okay? Very much in the way that, as we know for those who have been going through our time here, back in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, where we have the law of God, the 10 Commandments given once again, right, mirroring that of Exodus 20. We've learnt positive and negative laws, right? Negative laws, negative commands: you shall not do X, Y, Z. Positive: you shall do X, Y, Z. Okay? That very imperative that is given in Joshua, most concisely, as well as that features for us here today: do not fear, or its effective equivalents; be strong and courageous, in the words of Joshua and following. Follow and mirror, in that exact respect, the negative and positive commands of God, the laws. Okay? What we're wanting to see here, and really what the thrust of Moses' discourse is here, that will continue on into next week as well, as we progress from verse 10 and following throughout the rest of this chapter, is entirely in the context, at least originally speaking, of warfare. Okay? Much of the themes and the virtues and the ethics and the theology of what we're looking at today and in coming weeks through this chapter are concerning the martial sphere. Okay, martial, in other words, militant. Right? Here we have commands, of course, and very obviously laid out, this example being given where the troops are to go forth into battle. In fact, that is actually the very context that the book of Joshua begins with. Right? The peoples are amassed on the eastern side, in this case, of the Jordan River, beginning for the full-fledged invasion of the land of Canaan. Okay? And it is there that these very instructions that are given are actually lived out and practiced for the first time, at least chronologically speaking, following these commands. One thing that is of great note, and perhaps one of the most direct applications as we sit here now thousands of years later, after these words were spoken in ancient times, is to take and see one of the fundamental principles as to why, for starters, this command to be not afraid is given, as simplistic as that might sound. but also more importantly what really features in verses 5 through 8, which is a series of men who are exempt from military service. Okay? It seems like an odd thing to rouse the troops for warfare and to sound the horns of war, or to then spell out different exemptions for people who could sit at home and kick their feet up and lavish on grapes and so on and so forth, whatever one might have in mind, right? There is actually something very distinct and important as to why the particular categories that are given, and they are effectively a shorthand, right? But there are three primary categories that we'll actually be able to dissect and explain as we go through, that give us an eternal and perpetual principle. One that is, as of course, our aim going through an Old Testament book like Deuteronomy. We would know well, don't we, to take the general principle, the general equity of the law, as we properly call it in theological terms, and to understand its covenantal application in that of the New Testament, right? The New Covenant, okay? That where there are elements of civic commands that were particular to the ancient kingdom of Israel, there is inevitably the spirit of the law, as we often distinguish, right? The letter of the law and the spirit of the law, okay? This is really a combination of both, heavily upon, ultimately for us, the spirit of the law, for something which, again, in the great wisdom and eternal knowledge of God, is something that has manifold and manifest application for us even in our time, referring to that very principle. There are multiple things we'll talk about here, but there's one in particular that has very direct application. So let's jump in, of course, here at the very beginning of the passage. We'll begin, of course, in verse 1. If you go out to battle against your enemies, and you see horses, war horses, you see chariots and troops, people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, is with you. Now, the latter half of what we read there, some of those ending clauses, we're pretty familiar with that here in Deuteronomy, right? The reference to the God who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, who has rescued, I am the Lord your God, who has rescued you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, okay? Multiple times we have seen that phrase throughout Deuteronomy. It features, of course, even in the very essence of chapter 5, wherein the Ten Commandments are given that I referenced earlier. Here, again, these words, however, are not empty. They are being applied, as I mentioned in the introduction, to this martial context, this context of warfare. When you are heading forth out into battle against your enemies, not if you are, in that sense of if, as in it might happen, but it might not, okay? It is essentially more a when, right? When you head out into battle against your enemies, okay? This was not Moses saying the word if as an English preposition, right? To give them some hint that they might actually just be able to be slothful and live life on the fly and avoid anything too arduous or difficult or hard, let alone challenging. No. In this context, it is a matter of inevitability. They've already been told, of course we've covered that earlier on in this book, that they will indeed wage war against the Canaanite pagans, that they will enter a land filled with sin and evil and villainy, wherein human beings are kidnapped, where they are trafficked, where children are sacrificed to the gods, all these various different things that, of course, we know from history and archaeology occurred in the land of Canaan. They are marching forth into a physical embodiment of what we might use in the English aphorism, hell on earth. Okay? They are marching upon the kingdom of darkness. Because it's not just merely the physical aspect of the world. Again, we are not atheists, we're not materialists, we're not modern secularists. We know that there is the material reality, the physical reality of the world, and there is also the spiritual, that are harmonized, that go hand in hand. Right? When the great apostles proclaim that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, right, in other words, fleshly, but spiritual, they are not meaning to say that the affairs of the world are somehow irrelevant. No, it is calling on the Christian to have sagacity, to have wisdom, to have spiritual insight, okay? To see that through the physical events of the world in which you live, the spiritual goals and aims and plans of both the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of hell, of darkness, of Satan, are working in and through and by those means. Okay? Not separated, but in harmony, together, one through the other. As they are marching upon ancient peoples, tribal confederations that we call the Canaanites, they are ultimately, in the spiritual sense, marching upon powers of demons who rule those lands and who ruled those peoples, who received worship and honor and veneration through the rituals and the sacrifices and the religious practices of those same Canaanites. Okay? So here, in this particular instance, when they are going forth to fight their enemies, and you see war horses, you see chariots, you see armies amassed that outnumber you, probably pretty badly. Do not be afraid of them. The distinction that's being highlighted here, as I've just explained in the last couple of minutes, is already starting to come to fruition. Okay? If you read between the lines and see what is being set up, right, the foundation's being laid. Okay? As you look with your own carnal eyes, your corporeal eyes, your fleshly eyes, you see mighty armies. Okay? The Canaanites were a very warlike people, as of course were most of the ancient Near Eastern peoples, right? Though not of the great richness and wealth and geopolitical power of the kingdom of Egypt, nor of the Hittite Empire to the north, the Canaanites were very proficient in warfare, okay? And managed to hold their own to a pretty reasonable degree, all things considered, against both of those imperial powers to the north and to the south of that region. Okay? When you see this, when you see mighty war horses and you see entire cavalry units, right, of mounted warlords, when you see the chariots, which were effectively the fighter jets of the ancient military world, right? They were a powerful military technology that only certain peoples had, okay, especially the further back in history you go. And if an army had war chariots, you were effectively up the creek without a paddle, to use an English saying, okay? You're in a lot of trouble. You were going to have a very difficult time winning that battle, okay? Because the maneuverability, as well as just the raw power of momentum and inertia that an army can utilize and exploit to its advantage on the battlefield with chariot units was incredible, okay? The Egyptians, for those who are familiar with the book of Exodus, okay? Chariots that the Pharaoh and other Egyptian soldiers are riding on, they have war horses, all of these things, right? It's the advanced nature of ancient Near Eastern combat, 2nd millennium BC and beyond, right? However, beneath that is an actually more terrifying prospect, because this is not just merely men on horses, okay? This is not just merely men holding Bronze Age weaponry. Underneath that is a people unified by their common worship and devotion to demonic powers, who themselves are empowered, who are energized, for lack of a better term colloquially, by those very same demons, right? Who have a bloodlust and a fury for warfare to conquer and devour anything that would assail against them, as well as anything that they would seek to take for their own. Okay? Those various Canaanite peoples, and there are different Canaanite peoples in the general sense, right? In the north, in the south, so on and so forth, conquered their way to those lands. In fact, some of those northern Canaanite peoples you'll be familiar with, like, for example, Jezebel, right? Later on in the Old Testament, okay? A princess of the cities of Tyre and Sidon up in Phoenicia, what is today basically Lebanon essentially, right? Those were northern Canaanite peoples. They are the people who then build ships and mighty navies and build the greatest navy in the ancient world, effectively until the Romans, and conquered large and vast swaths of the Mediterranean world, and their most famous descendants you may well be familiar with if you are anything of a history buff, the Carthaginian Empire. Okay? When you see this, the natural temptation, and indeed a very understandable one, is of course dread. It is fear. It takes an exceptionally rare warrior on the battlefield to be unfazed by the prospect of overwhelming odds. Exceptionally rare. Right? You're talking 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million. Right? It is just something that is almost by spiritual constitution unique in that regard. Right? No matter how well trained you are as a force, whenever you are facing an overwhelming enemy army, right, with greater technology, with greater numbers, with greater resources, whatever it happens to be, there is no stopping the bubbling up, as it were, of the natural instinct of fear. Okay? This is why the first point you must see here today is that when they are told, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out of the land is with you, God is not condemning the natural fear instinct. Okay? God has given you that as an act of self-preservation. Right? When you are wandering through the ever-treacherous and hazardous bush of Australia with 1,000 little critters who can, with one single bite or sting, send you straight into paradise, right? For Australians who live in the bush, like up here, we're fairly used to those things, of course. But if one is not, and they alight upon the ever-lurking brown snake, right, which only is one of the 10 most venomous snakes on the planet, and has enough venom to kill at least everyone on this side of the aisle, right, as well as everyone on that side of the aisle, right? And the great advantage is that they're only everywhere. There is a fear response that comes when one sees that if one is not accustomed to it, okay? That's an instinct that God has given us, right? To realize when there is fear, right? So when there is something to fear, and to realize when there is danger. Yeah? So when we see these words, do not be afraid or do not fear, the point to understand is this. It is not a condemnation of that fear instinct, right? God has given you that as an act for self-preservation and survival. What it is talking about is what he is then going to unfold for us right here and now, okay? Verse 2 following. Now it will be when you are drawing near to them, right, in battle that is, okay, the priest shall approach and speak to the people. So this is interesting. It's going to set up what he's about to say here. It's not the king, although of course the king will do that. Right? We see examples like when David addresses his troops before battle. Okay? We see various other elements along those lines also throughout the rest of the books of the Chronicles and the Kings, so on and so forth. But here, the imperative is being given to the clergy. Okay? In this case, the Old Covenant, the priests, right? The Levitical priesthood, to address the armies, right? To give an exhortation, one that is spiritual. Because what here God is doing is highlighting and actually making an example of exactly what we mentioned earlier, right? The physical, material, corporeal reality, very true, and the spiritual reality that undergirds or underlies that, right? So here, it is not the generals or the unit commanders that address the troops first, right? You would think that would be a pretty logical thing, because after all, they are about to head into battle, right? As the troops are being mustered, or technically not even mustered yet, but as they're being mustered in colloquial terms, what God is recognizing is that the spiritual well-being of the troops needs to be addressed of utmost importance, of first importance, right? Of prime, in that literal sense, importance. That before they even begin to muster, they need to be encouraged and exhorted spiritually. Because they are not just fighting with swords and with shields and with chariots and with war horses. They are fighting with their spirit. They are fighting with their soul. They are fighting with their mind. They are fighting with their godly and honourable virtues. All of this, right, is being laid out here in its most foundational sense. Okay? It is making of the greatest and highest significance for these ancient Israelites before they head out into battle against the Canaanites, the spiritual side of things. Because if the spiritual side of things, as we're going to see throughout this chapter, but particularly here, is set, the physical will follow. Right? However, the opposite, the inverse of that, is not inherently true. The physical may be taken care of, but that is no guarantee at all that the spiritual will be. We see countless examples of that. Even actually, historically speaking, not long after this. Right? It is in the very book of Joshua, wherein the Israelites amass troops, go forth into battle against the specifics of God's commands, and they lose the Ark of the Covenant. Right? For anyone who's familiar with that part of the book of Joshua. Because they were focused on the physical and neglecting the spiritual. They were focused on the physical matters, neglected the spiritual matters. Right? Because ultimately, it is not just the physical that is imperative. It is real, but it is not the only thing. The spiritual is as well. They must go in hand. They must be harmonized. They must, in ultimate senses, be built upon the foundation of that spiritual principle. So here, the fact that it is a priest who comes forth and exhorts them lays the right and necessary foundation for what they are about to undertake and embark upon. And his words, as we see there, "Hear, O Israel," right? He is hearkening on the people using those familiar words. Okay, "Hear, O Israel." He is calling them to listen to the word of God, right? These are not the priest's words, it's not the clergyman's words, right? As if he's giving them some valuable military insight that they somehow don't have, that he does, right? No. This is the word of God being proclaimed over the army. Okay? "Hear, O Israel, this day you are drawing near to battle against your enemies. Do not let your heart be faint." Right? "Do not be afraid. Do not be alarmed. Do not be in dread before them." So the ultimate command of "do not let your heart grow faint," in other words, do not fall to cowardice, is what that essentially means, and then gives three kind of partitioned exhortations in line with that to really explain that. Right? Do not let your heart grow faint. Well, how? Do not be afraid of them. Do not be alarmed. In other words, panic. And do not be in dread before them. He's actually explaining exactly how armies can lose the battle in here and in here before they ever lose it out here. Okay? The troops, soldiers, warriors, let alone entire units, let alone entire armies, that begin to fear their enemy, genuinely fear their enemy on the battlefield, now become susceptible to panic. Okay? As fear begins to seep in on the battle space, lack of control is what is the biggest problem when fear sets in. Okay? It's one of the single biggest threats that any warrior on the battlefield faces. Right? Because where there is lack of control, and more importantly, the fear of a widening gap in our ability to actually defeat these people, right? Nervousness, anxiousness begins to sit in. Panic begins to bubble, right? What you might have phrased here, "do not be alarmed," right? Alarm in that sense, okay? Grave worry and concern, panic, right? And when that happens, and warrior loses the grip that he has on his own mind and his own heart, terror sets in, right? An impending doom. Okay? At that point, he's mentally checked out of the fight. Right? That is the progression that happens in the mind. That is the progression that happens in the spirit of a soldier. Okay? That is how you end up with scenarios, right? Where, if you've ever watched, as completely aggrandized and hyper-fictionalized as they are, films, right, about, or television shows about World War I or World War II, right? These gigantic industrialized wars with tanks and with bombers and with machine guns and with firebombing and mustard gas and everything else in between. When you see a soldier, right, a grown man, 20-something years old, right, in the fetal position, crying and literally begging for his mother, right, it is because that progression has happened. Fear has set in, right? He has not controlled the fear instinct. Panic begins to swell and to swell and to swell and to swell until dread takes over, right? And you become non-functional, right? You just start, the mind and the spirit and the body just starts shutting down, checking out, right? And every person to whom that happens on the battlefield is one more opportunity for everyone who has not succumbed to that to die. Okay? That is especially true in all contexts, but perhaps even in these ancient contexts where things like shield walls were the way of warfare. Think like the Greek phalanx, if you're familiar at all with history. Okay? You are utterly dependent, and this is not just for trivia's sake, I'm actually doing this to explain the point. In the ancient form of warfare, where you would have shield walls or shield formations, right, especially in the more advanced forms, like I mentioned, just the Greek phalanx, okay, you were dependent on the man to your left or to your right, depending on the structure, for protection. Okay? Your shield only covered, right, especially as standing here, your half of the body in which you're holding your shield. Okay? You're fighting with your right hand, shield in the left. It only covers your left side of the body. The other side of your shield is covering the right side of your teammate. Do you understand? It's entirely dependent on unit cohesion. Okay. There has to be unity among the men. If one breaks, what begins to happen to that formation? It begins to crumble. Because as soon as one is down, then another man is only half protected. And if he goes down, now another person is only half protected. Do you see the problem? Okay. Especially in the greatest sense, in which battlefield panic sets in and troops start fleeing the battlefield. Right? That's the ultimate end of where this goes to. Right? And the consequences of that are slaughters beyond which you can comprehend if you are not familiar with military history. As soon as an army quits mentally or physically and begins literally fleeing the battlefield, right, running for their lives, it is like the young gazelle in the Serengeti who starts fleeing from the rest of the herd, or the little baby zebra who makes the horribly fatal decision of abandoning the rest of the zebras wherein it is hidden and begins just fleeing off out into the plains for the pride of lions to hunt it down and to devour it. Okay? That is what happens. It's what we call a routing, okay, to be routed. Some of the greatest slaughters in military history have been because of that very thing which here God is commanding against, to prevent. Do not be afraid. Control your fear. Again, it is not the condemnation of the instinct to go, oh, this is dangerous. Right? Yes, it is dangerous. Swords and war hammers and battle axes, arrows flying from God knows where. Right? You finish fighting this guy to the death to turn around and see 10 troops get ploughed over by an entire cavalry unit right in front of you. You see men speared through the face. You see arrows laden in bodies. You see everything, right? This is dangerous, and the instinct of that is normal. What he is commanding is that the soldier, the warrior, must control his fear. He must not allow fear to control him. Do you understand? And the fact that the priest is saying this, the fact that the clergyman is saying this, is underlying that this is not just a matter of being physically tough. Okay? Physical toughness is good, right? You want troops on a battlefield, if we're talking just purely in the warfare context, who are big, who are fast, who are strong, who can endure, who are physically robust and tough, right? Who are intimidating. All those things are advantages in warfare. But, Christian, none of those things are guarantees of spiritual fortitude. Okay? This might seem obvious, it might not seem obvious, I have no idea. It depends on your background or your history. Okay? When we see on the surface level someone who looks really tough, especially as a man, right? We go, "Oh, that guy's intimidating, that guy's tough." Right? He might be. He might also be an absolute wimp. He might also be a complete pushover. Okay? He may have a beard, he may have the long hair, he has the tats, he has all kinds of things, right? Pick whatever stereotypical Hollywood-like image you want to use, right? He might actually be a real tough guy, or he might not be. Right? The external without the internal is nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing at all. Okay? It doesn't mean you don't concern yourself with the external, but see this as the final point for this section. Merely looking at the external does not tell the whole story. If you looked at the apostles, there was not a tough guy among them by any overt sense. Peter would probably be the only exception to that. John, as well as Andrew, perhaps also the sons of thunder, right? They were so nicknamed by the Lord, right? Peter would probably qualify for that within reason, as a rural country peasant from up north in Galilee, okay, as a fisherman, right? He did not swing his sword in an attempt to try and kill the guards during the arresting of the Lord in Gethsemane merely by accident, right? He and the disciples were very much willing to fight, okay? But there's perhaps no greater example than the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was older, especially as you work your way through the book of Acts, frail, right? Had his own physical infirmities, right? The thorn in his side, as he refers to it. He was described as being shorter in a time where generally in the ancient world men are shorter than they are now, right? So being described as short would be considerably short, right, by today's standards. There was nothing physically impressive at all about St. Paul. Yet he endured and endured and endured and endured. He suffered without complaint. In fact, he did the opposite. He rejoiced in his sufferings. He realized that this grew virtue within him. It realized that this was his spiritual and physical battle testing, right, to hijack a term there, right? He wasn't a warrior in the physical sense, but he was a warrior in the spiritual sense, right? He endured beatings. He endured tortures. He endured all manner of natural disasters and physical things, from his famous shipwrecking, of course, or infamous shipwrecking, I should say. All manner of things. Of course, he was stoned virtually within an inch of his life in Derbe, in southern Galatia. All these kinds of things. The internal, the spiritual, was the rock, the foundation for anything outward and physical that he did. That is the essence of what they are highlighting here. Because if they don't have it, if the Israelites had have marched on Canaan under their own external military might, of which they had none, they would be slaughtered. something else had to be the foundation for them. It has to be the spiritual. In this case, why are they told to not fear? Are they told to just generate some great muster of valor within them, to look within and find some spark of martial heroism? No, they're not, are they? How are they commanded to not fear? What is the key ingredient? To remember, in other words, not just intellectually, but to know. Spiritually, in the heart, in the soul, in the mind. To know that, of course, as we see there, the ending of verse 4, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you into battle, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. This is what Joshua says in the opening chapter of the book of Joshua. It is what ultimately Psalm 20 proclaims. You can turn there with me if you would like, but Psalm 20 specifically, won't read all of it. But just to give you the wording of Psalm 20, verses 6 through 9, the explanation as to how and to why this is the case. Psalm 20, beginning in verse 6, reads, "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed." Of course, David is that anointed and also simultaneously speaks forth of his own descendant, Christ. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. Okay, now if you're unfamiliar with that phrase, that is a distinctly martial phrase. Right? In other words, the one I just read, with the saving might of his right hand. Okay, the right hand, the right arm is used in this anthropomorphic sense when describing God, okay, to describe warfare. Right? The right hand is the hand that wields the sword. Okay? His mighty arm you will sometimes see, for example. Okay? God is spirit, right? And prior to the incarnation, he doesn't have hands, doesn't have arms or eyes or any of these things. These are all anthropomorphisms. Okay? But his mighty hand, his right hand. Okay? It's a distinctly martial phrase. Right? Verse 7. Some boast in chariots and some in war horses. The very same things referenced in chapter 20, verse 1 of Deuteronomy. But, in contrast to that, we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. The pagans, they boast in their military might and power. They boast in their gargantuan Defense Department budget, right, to use modern terms. They boast in their vast arsenal of war horses and of chariots and of spears and of swords and of shields and of naval ships and so on and so forth, right? All these kinds of things. We boast in the name, i.e. the authority and the power of the Lord our God. Do you understand? The boast, in other words, where is the source of pride and glory? That's what's meant by boast here. Okay? Where do we place our confidence? Right? As Goliath came forth onto the battlefield as the champion of Philistia, and the Philistine armies, which vastly outnumbered that of the Israelites, stood there, what did they cheer in? What did they boast in? They boasted in Goliath's power. They boasted in the fact that this man was undefeated in battle. That all who had stood against him had fallen. Every man who had stepped forth in champion combat, as that's called, to face the champion of Philistia had been cut down. He was the living embodiment of a great warrior, right? Not the only one in the ancient world, there were many great warriors, right? But that is exactly what he stood for and emblemized. And of course, he is empowered by the demons whom he worships. He is their servant. They aid him in battle. That is what is meant in that contrast, right? Some boast in chariots and war horses or in champion warriors, right? All the same category. We boast in the name of the Lord our God. We place our boast, our confidence, our pride, our glory, our hope, as a result, not in our own martial power or prowess, which could be great or small, but rather in God. That is the why behind these words that we have here before us. Hence, the priest's command: do not fear, do not be afraid of them, do not panic, do not be terrified. Because God has already saved you out of Egypt, and he didn't save you out of Egypt for nothing. I want you to see this point very clearly and importantly. He's pointing to the fact that God, the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that's the ending of verse 1, saves you. God has already shown you, Old Testament Christian, that he has the power to defeat all of Egypt. He has shown you this. You have seen, right, or some of them for the new generation, your parents have seen. You have lived and heard the stories of what this God has done, right? But some of these people will have seen it with their own eyes, okay? Those who were young at the time, who were children at the time of the Exodus. You've seen or have heard the stories of how God miraculously saved you out of the clutches of the most powerful kingdom in all the world at this time. How God destroyed the Egyptian army, or the great mass of it, to such a degree that at this point in history, in Egyptian history, Egypt doesn't fight another major battle or another major war for almost 20 years. Right? At this exact time in ancient Egyptian history and archaeology, there is a near 2-decade-long gap in its martial records and warfare. Okay? It didn't have any considerable army, at least in terms of numbers and power. Right? And there is nothing more that the ancient Egyptians know, right? Take this from a historian. There is nothing that the ancient Egyptians loved more than boasting about their armies. Right? According to the ancient Egyptian records, Egypt never lost a battle. It's true. There's not one single record in all of ancient Egypt of Egypt ever losing a war, ever losing a battle. Even though, of course, we know that they did, right? We know that there are battles where their enemies claimed the victory, right? But at best, it was Egypt claiming the moral victory and then just riding back off to Egypt, right? God showed them that he was infinitely more powerful than even the great and mighty God King of Egypt, the Pharaoh. That the Pharaoh's armies were nothing in the wake of the power of he who created the storms and the seas. That is what he's reminding them of. It is upon that basis now we get to the really streamlined portion, right? Verses 5 through 9. I'm going to read it as a whole chunk, okay? I'm going to read at least 5 to 8 as the chunk, and then we'll tack on 9 at the end, okay? So verses 5 through 8 of Deuteronomy chapter 20. The officers, we've covered these before a couple of chapters ago, right? Ending of chapter 16, beginning of chapter 17. These are the elders, the statesmen, effectively, of the kingdom, of the people, right? They are the political rulers and administrators underneath the king, eventually later on, okay? The officers also shall speak to the people, not first. Okay, so thank God they weren't being talked to by politicians and bureaucrats first off, right? It was the clergy who spoke to them first off, okay? Then come in the governmental magistrates, right? We use the term officers. It's not military officers, it's civic officers, okay? Those who had the legal authority to muster the armies under the command of the king, right? The officers shall also speak to the people, saying, "Who is the man that has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man dedicate it. Who is the man that has planted a vineyard and has not yet begun to use its fruits? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man begin to use its fruits. And who is the man who is engaged to a woman and has not yet married her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man marry her." Then the officers shall speak further to the people and say, "Who is the man who is afraid and whose heart is faint? let him go and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's heart melt like his. Okay. 3 categories, and then one little addendum. Right? The man who has built a house yet has not dedicated it, right? Hasn't lived in it, hasn't enjoyed it, all those various things. Okay? Let him go, right? He's exempt from the service. Until, of course, a year later, 2 years later, whatever it is, blah, blah. He's done those things, now he is eligible. Right? Now he will become part of the army. Okay? Who's the man who has planted a vineyard? Right? In other words, has a business. Okay? In this case, it's a vineyard. Right? It's used for a very specific example I'll explain in a minute. Yet, it's a brand new vineyard. He hasn't yet had the time to reap the harvest, to enjoy the fruits of his labour, literally in this case, right? To drink the great wine that has come from those vineyards, so on and so forth. Let him go and do that. Okay? Who is betrothed to a woman, right? Engaged, as we say now, right? Yet has not married her, does not have children with her yet, has not been able to start a family with her yet. Let him go. He's exempt. Okay? All 3 of those naturally will, in one form or another, either all of them or a combination thereof, somehow go together. Okay? Because, of course, the man who is betrothed to a woman, right, according to right custom, has prepared a house for her. Do you understand? It's used in specific terms. Has prepared a room for her in his father's house. That's the custom. That's where you get that reference in the New Testament, if you're familiar with it. Okay? When the marital covenantal relationship between Christ and the church is used in that symbolic sense as well. Okay? He's prepared the place where they will live in his father's estate, okay? In his father's home, whatever that happens to look like, great or small, but yet hasn't had the ability to. So all those things can go together. Okay? The house, the vineyard, the wife. We'll just use that in simple terms, or the family, same thing. Okay? Let them go. Right? They are not to march forth into battle. They are exempt from service until they have then done those things. Right? Established the household, established the vineyard or the business, established the family, right? Has actually now formally married the wife, although at this point was betrothed anyway, it's basically a done deal. Has had kids, right? Then he becomes eligible for service. Now, the simple, and I should really probably more directly say simplistic, overly simplistic reading of this would be to erroneously deduce that this is purely administrative, because after all, we had officers of the state mentioned, right? We had civic administrators, references the ones who actually organised and, as the term says, administered these details, right? This is not merely bureaucratic instructions being given. There's actually something that might even perhaps be one of the greatest principles you should take away from this passage, dare I say, okay? These 3 categories are deeply formative and essential to human life. It is the household, right, you have established. The place that is your one refuge, or what is meant to be your one refuge in this world. Right? A place that even in Anglo-Saxon law, in the common law of Britain, which this nation is founded upon, is by right and law sacrosanct. That the violation of property is a grave evil. Even at the lower, quote-unquote, lower levels, the middling levels of theft, let alone the concept of breaking and entering, as we use, or as the terms used by the Americans, right? Entering and violating the sanctity of someone else's home is a grave thing in the common law of British and now Australian culture. The vineyard, the business, the actual economic production, right? The ability to provide resources for that household and the people who live in that household as the means of not just survival, but hopefully by God's blessings, thriving, right? Of stewardship, of custodianship, of using the skills and the talents and the abilities that God has given each and every one of us in our different ways for not our own vainglory and self-gratification, but for the betterment of our house, right? The people, which of course then is consummated literally and figuratively with and through marriage. What these three elements are, the house, the vineyard or the business, and the wife or the family, this is actually quite literally the definition of the economy. Right? We get that English term economy from the ancient Greek, right? From the biblical Greek. Oikonomia. Oikos, household. Nomos, law or rule. The law of the household, the rule of the household, how the household is administered. That is quite literally what the term economy means. Right? We think of the economy as this big, amorphous digital thing out there with markets and graphs and ones and zeros on computer screens and all these kinds of things out there. And no, the economy in its most direct sense, historically, as much as we've been bereft of that now, is the productivity and fruitfulness, literally and figuratively, of households, of families. Okay? These are the good things that are blessings of God. In fact, all three of those things are described in Genesis or Exodus or Numbers, and even actually in Deuteronomy, as covenantal blessings from God. Okay? A stable and safe household, a productive household family enterprise, that's the vineyard. Wife and children, or the other way, husband and children, right, for the women. Okay? All three of these things are routinely described as covenantal blessings, which is why they're also, a number of chapters later here in Deuteronomy, in chapter 28, where the covenant curses are enumerated. In other words, here are the consequences for apostasy and rebellion against God. Right? All three of those things are likewise mentioned. Right? In chapter 28, verse 30. Okay? I'll read it to you even just briefly. You shall not, in regard to this, you shall betroth the wife. This is chapter 28 I'm talking about, in Deuteronomy. You shall betroth the wife, but another man will violate her. You shall build a house, but you will not live in it. You shall plant a vineyard, but you will not use its fruits. Right? Your wife, your family will be destroyed, will be violated. Your household will be taken and lived in by others. The economic production of your business, of your fruits of your labour, will be taken from you. These are the covenantal curses. Right? All of which are happening now, but that's a different sermon. Okay? What's being pointed to here? Okay? These are the good things that are blessings from God. Right? The great arrogance of our time is in the fact that we place in our modern secularist, humanist understanding of the world and the philosophy of our societies self-aggrandizement, right? It's by our own might and power. We give no honour and glory to God, okay? In a general sense, I'm not saying specifically. Right? And yet all of our technology, all of our advanced mechanics, all of our industrial might and power is utterly failing to save us from decadence and degeneracy and civilizational decay, which is what is occurring now in Europe and European-descended civilizations like ours. Here, God is acknowledging that war is at best a tragedy, and at worst, a horrific plight and evil that destroys households, that razes vineyards and farmlands to the ground, that obliterates and slaughters wives and children, right? The fodder of warfare and its destructive powers, right? All these kinds of things. These young men, because of course in this context it's not an old man who doesn't have this, right? This is the 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old young man who's just starting out these things in life. That's who's in view here. Okay? But here's the deeper level, that thing that I mentioned, one of the most important principles to take away today. That's the material. Okay? That is the outside, that's the external. That is the corporeal, that's the material reality, right? The physical household, the physical business and enterprise, for lack of a better term, the physical family, all these kinds of things. All good, all virtuous, all righteous in their own respect, all physical. Here's the spiritual undergirding of this. and why these men were exempt. The men who have established and built their household, who have founded and cultivated, especially literally in the case of a vineyard, cultivated their business, their enterprise, the thing in life that they use to provide for those who are dependent on them, their wife and their children, and even other rest of the family, if that's the case, right? This family, this aspect of the clan, right? And those family members themselves. The men who have known these things, who have had children, who have an enterprise and a business, all of that taken together, they are the men who know exactly what they're fighting for. Do you understand? Yes? Good. You see the young, starry-eyed 17-year-old, 16-year-old, or even going up north of that, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20, whatever it is. The young man. He's not a boy. He's now a young man. He is unfamiliar with the scent of blood in the air. He is unfamiliar with the sight of torn limbs in the mud. He is not yet accustomed to what it takes and what is required in terms of your mental and your spiritual constitution, your fortitude, to be able to endure those things and those great horrors of man and of spiritual powers without collapsing and crumbling within. He's not familiar with any of that. Okay? He has the propensity, in other words, the risk, for the luster of the adventure of warfare. This was unfortunately something that many of our young men and many of the young men of the West faced and endured in particularly the First World War. Right? A great journey to the Ottoman Empire. 4 or 5 months, I think about 4 months by that point, 4 months at sea, sailing out of all the major ports of Australia, particularly Hobart and Sydney and Melbourne, to journey to the far side of the world, to return back to the Mediterranean and European world, which many of those young men by this point had not yet known. They were born here. They were natives now of this land. Right? To face an empire that had long assailed against Europe, that had been at one point the very dread of Europe, that at one point was the most powerful army in the world in the 16th century, which had advanced so far as Vienna in the centre and heartland of Austria and of Europe, which had only been stopped by great crusaders and of warriors like the winged hussars of Poland and the amassed knights of the Holy League, which had only been stopped by the Knights Hospitaller and others at Malta in great sieges and these great heroic battles. This is who we were going over to fight. In an ancient land where Troy is but a stone's throw away and legends of ancient Greece fill the air. Right until, like my great-grandfather, you're on the first wave off the ship and off the landing boats at Anzac Cove at Gallipoli. And until you have been to Gallipoli, as I have had the great honour of doing, and stand there on the beach overlooking the gigantic cliff faces, scoured with Turkish machine guns, as it was on the 25th of April 1915, you don't know fear. You do not know horror. You do not know terror until you have stood there like that. Let alone the great horrors even of much greater accord and of numerous numbers, like that which was faced by the Americans and the British and the Canadians during the invasion of Normandy, right, in World War II. All these kinds of things. This starry-eyed vision of warfare is the sight of the person who is himself a virgin in war, who does not know the horrors of it. Right? What this is doing is providing a safeguard. Because on the flip side of that, those who have now, in the case of the men, established their household, lived in it, worked it, stewarded it, acted as a custodian for it with their business, their enterprise, have married their wife, have known their wife, have loved their wife, had children, have raised those children, or are raising those children, I should say, are loving those children, are providing for those children. All these various elements, that's the man who has skin in the game. Right, as we say in English. Right? He has skin in the game. In other words, he has a vested interest. If we lose, my household is burnt, my fields are razed, my wife is raped, my children are slaughtered or enslaved. Welcome to warfare. That's the man who knows what he is fighting for, and more importantly, that is the man who will fight to the death. Because he's not fighting for himself. Notice that none of these categories have anything to do with you doing it for yourself. Right? That's not the command being given. In fact, that's commanded against in many places. He's also not doing it out of blind hatred for his enemies, as natural an inclination as that could possibly be. He's not doing it for self-aggrandizement. He's not doing it for forward-facing hatred. What is he doing it for, then? He is doing it for the love of those who are behind him. And then in the context of the battle, for the love of the men who are beside him. Right? This is why warriors, it's why soldiers develop such unbreakable bonds with their teammates, being forged through the fire and crucible of battle, knowing that man is utterly dependent on you doing your job properly, and that your life is utterly dependent on him doing his. It brings a bond between men that nothing can even bring, that even in one sense at least, marriage can't bring. Right? Those guys are essential. And the lesson that Christians heed from this, and by the way, this is a lesson that many Christians have been taught throughout the millennia now for thousands of years, is that when you have skin in the game, when you have a vested interest, when you have something to fight for, you will fight with courage, with valor, with honor, with integrity, and with faith. Because if you are the Israelite standing there 3,500 years ago, facing down the armies of Canaan, you are outnumbered by grotesque and almost comical numbers. You are outgunned, to use the modern term, right, in terms of technology, military technology. Your battle experience is between nothing and duck eggs, 0. And they only have all the experience. In mortal senses, you are lambs to the slaughter in many respects. Right? Your parents have fought some battles, against the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan. You, however, now under Joshua, which is what's about to progress after this, have no battle experience. You've had no deployments, none. Either God saves me this day and God saves us all, or we're doomed and done. Right? That's the reality of it. That's what he means by the Lord your God saves you. Hence why that fourth and final category that I have not yet mentioned, which is the ending there of that verse, right? Verse 8. Who is the man who is afraid and has let his heart grow faint? Let him go and return to his house so that he might not make his brother's heart melt like his. The other three categories were all about material goods, for lack of a better term, not yet enjoyed. This, however, is different. Any man who recognizes and has the humility to recognize that he is not up for this, you're free to go home. Because your cowardice will only get your teammates killed. That's what he means by make your heart melt, right? It's just an ancient expression, right? Making the heart melt is meaning like cowardice, okay? Fear, right? Demoralization, to use the modern term in warfare, okay? Faint, melting, these kinds of things, okay? Not the strong heart, right? Not like Richard, the lion-heart, one of the great kings of England, the Crusader king, okay? The lion-hearted. That man, right, and by extension the spiritual sense woman, who is cowardly, who is not brave, who is not courageous, who is not valiant in the face of evil, you are a liability. Now that, not only as much, but in fact even more probably than anything of the other categories that we've read so far, is as directly applicable back then as it is to you now. When it comes to the great evils that prevail and pervade in today's society, when it comes to the various different attacks that are used and utilized and propagated against the church, all of these various things, from social and cultural things like abortion and sexual degeneracy, all the way up to more political things, things even international, things local, things at all ends of various spectrums, whatever you happen to think of. The fight that we as Christians are in, and make no mistake, you are in a fight, you are in a war. Most people sitting in pews have not yet allotted to that fact. But my role as a minister of God is to remind you of that reality. All of the things that are going on, which we talk about quite often here, these are spiritual matters being executed out throughout physical means. Okay? They are demonic powers. They are powers of evil. They are corrupt powers which seek to assail against the church and against God's people. The reason why we have suffered, right, I'm speaking more in our context here, right? The reason why we have suffered, the reason why we have seen the decline, the reason why we have seen, right, speaking again, as I said, in our own context, of going from a great and mighty empire, in the case of the British Empire, to a place, and now disparate places, that are filled with political corruption, that are filled with economic corruption, that are filled with social degeneracy, that are filled with irreligion and atheism, and filled with all manner now of pagan religions having been flooded into the West, intentionally and by design. All of these things have happened as, in large respect, not everyone, obviously, I'm speaking in generalities, in large part, as Christians, especially and particularly the men in my position, have stood by and done nothing. Have done essentially nothing. Have stood by and complained, but have stood by and aided and abetted. We have aided and abetted as ideologies have taken over our schools, and yet we have kept sending our kids there. We have aided and abetted as various different political parties have arisen with ideologies so manifestly antagonistic to the Christian religion, who have worked to assail against the Christian religion, and yet have not just merely done nothing, but in fact often aided it, have accepted government grants, have worked in government programs, have done all manner of things that have made us politically and financially dependent on various government departments, have sought to be culturally popular and that ever dangerous word relevant, all the while making ourselves utterly irrelevant. Make no mistake, you do not go from a Christian civilization that is 98, 99% Christian in certain parts, where you are raised in a society where basically everyone that you know is a Christian. You do not go from that kind of world, which is the world and the life that such nations have known, to a world, right, your own world, where hardly anyone that you know is Christian. You do not do that purely by victimdom. In other words, it's not merely just things that happen against us. No, it's because the brutal reality of history is that throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st, we have been failing. Too many of the ministers in my position have been cowards, have been weak, have been soft. And I do not mean, referencing my words earlier, in the machismo, beat you to a pulp sense. Do you understand? I mean spiritually, ethically, morally. I mean the virtues of courage and endurance, of patience, of faith, of hope, of bravery. That's what I mean. Who have sought to teach you things that they thought were popular to you. Who have sought to coddle you emotionally as opposed to telling you what you need to hear. Because what you need to hear at times are messages of great hope and encouragement in our Lord Jesus Christ. Other times, they need to tell you what Jesus Christ has already told you, which is, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. You're doing this, stop doing that. You're living this way, stop living that way. You think this is right and good, it's not, it's evil. Repent. That's the job of the minister, that's the job of the shepherd. To actually be the ones who should have led you in standing up against manifold evils, but have failed to. I hate to do it for the 1,792nd time, but please see COVID. Right? Reference 2020 and 2021 for the example of everything I've ever said. Okay? The coward gets people killed. Thus, why, to leave you with this, verse 9. Now it will be that when the officers have finished speaking to the people, they shall appoint commanders of armies at the head of the people. Now that's a very passing detail, straightforward and simple enough. There's nothing really to explain in terms of the detail there. But what is the point that's being said? And this is what I want you to see. He appoints, or they appoint, as say, the officers appoint the military commanders. They give them the authority to muster the troops and to march forth into war. Right? But notice what's said, at the head of the people. The leaders led from the front. Do you understand? For anyone who has seen the historical epic Troy back from the 2000s, it opens with a fictionalized scene of the great warrior Achilles, okay, from the story of the Iliad. He fights a Theban warrior known as, Agrius, and kills him with a single fatal blow. Right? But before marching out to that battle, Achilles, the great and mighty warlord, is asleep off in his tent. And the Mycenaean king of Greece, Agamemnon, has to send an errand boy, a runner, to go and fetch him because the armies have amassed and Achilles is still having a nap and drinking wine and doing whatever else he wants to do, sleeping in at that time. And of course, he comes begrudgingly to the battlefield as a great warrior, this kind of untamed, loosely tamed lion that the Greek kings barely have control of. And the king Agamemnon in that fictionalized scene says to him, I ought to have you flogged for your insolence, right, in not coming to the battle when called. And of course Achilles turns to him in the movie and says, well, perhaps you should fight him yourself then, as he starts to walk away. And then, of course, Agamemnon and the other kings, like his brother Menelaus, king of Sparta, so on and so forth, say, no, come back. And then Achilles agrees to go forth. But he says one final jest to the king Agamemnon. He says, a king who fights his own battles, wouldn't that be a sight? It is no wonder, now having come full circle, that great Philistine warrior Goliath that I mentioned earlier was faced down by whom? Was he faced down by Saul? No, he wasn't faced down by Saul. Was he faced down even by the elder brothers of the clan of Jesse? No, even though they had plenty of military experience between them. Who is he faced down by? The young shepherd boy David. Small, young teenager, not yet accustomed to full-fledged warfare, accustomed to killing off wolves and other things like that. But it is the future king who went forth into battle and won for his people a great and historic victory that you read of some 3,000 years later. This is precisely what Christ, our Lord, his own descendant, has done. Because you want to talk about skin in the game? God did not merely reside and preside and contain himself to the heavens, giving you dictates down here, ordering you around like the Greek gods would do, for example. No, as we indeed confess in the Nicene Creed, he became man. Right? He was incarnate by the Holy Spirit of the Virgin Mary. God became one of us to live for us, to sacrifice himself for us. Because now, as he is making atonement for our sins, he is the very God who has walked where we walked, who has lived and established in his own household, who has put his hand to work as a carpenter, who has, just as Adam, of course, was condemned to, labored by the sweat of his brow. He has been hungry. He has been in need. He has been in want, in the physical sense. He has endured sleepless nights. He has seen the oppression of his people. He has endured oppression from his enemies. He has suffered at the hands of the powers of darkness and of Satan himself. He has been tempted by Satan, none other, in ways far surpassing anything that you and I are ever tempted by. None of us are tempted with the power of dominion over the world. All these things. He has endured the agony of torture. He has endured the physical struggle of carrying his cross, quite literally, the roughly mile distance to Golgotha. He has endured the pain of his own death and sacrifice. All of that is the very embodiment of this. Do you understand? To build his household, to bring to fruition the fruit of the vine with he the branch, and to secure the betrothment of his wife, his bride, the church. He's done all three. And he did not succumb to that fourth category of cowardice. He came forth into the battle and war for the fate of mankind. And he succeeded. That is why these things are spoken of. Because he is the great commander of the armies of heaven, who has quite literally led from the front. He did not simply even send his angelic powers as the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the angelic armies, to do his bidding for him. He did not send one of his angels to make sacrifice on our behalf. No, he did it himself. That is the God that you serve and worship. That is the one who upholds this. That is the one in whose image and visage you are called to live and to walk and to be. It is the very icon of God who is to be your inspiration for all that you set your hand to in your life. So may we know what we have a vested interest in. As we withstand attacks against us, not only individually, but collectively as Christianity, as the church universal, we have a vested interest. We have skin in the game. We are not fighting for ourselves. We are not enduring persecution in whatever degree it comes for ourselves and for our own glory, for there will be none. We are doing it for every one of us who is sitting right next to you right now. You are doing it for your children or your grandchildren for some of you. You are doing it for children you have not yet had. You are doing it for wives or for husbands in the other direction whom you have not yet married. You are doing it for a future that you have not yet experienced. That is what's on the line. Because make no mistake, there are powers and forces assailing against us who seek to destroy you, whose unironic objective in life is to see the annihilation of your religion and of you. We are at a stage where if they could kill you with impunity, they would. They are already, in certain respects, in certain places, doing that. Know what you're fighting for. Know why you're fighting for it. And then know that it is God who will guarantee us the victory. Because if Christ has died and been buried and risen from the dead, if he has truly conquered death by his death, if he has vanquished the stranglehold of darkness in this world, which as Christians we do believe, do we not? Then in that particular instance or case, on that reality, anything against us right now, Christ is victorious over. That is what we fight upon. Amen.